When I first moved into my new house, it felt like a fresh start. After years of renting cramped apartments, I finally had a place to call my own. A small, cozy house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and the sense of pride and excitement that came with it was hard to describe. The street was lined with beautiful old trees, and most of the houses were occupied by families or older couples who had lived there for decades. It was the kind of place where everyone waved to each other from their porches, where kids played in the yards, and where I thought I'd finally find some peace. I spent my weekends working on the yard, getting to know the neighbors, and settling into a comfortable routine. The house next door had been vacant when I moved in, so I had no one directly beside me. That is, until one day I noticed a moving truck pull into the driveway. A man, probably in his early 50s, got out of the truck. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a grizzled beard and hard eyes. He looked like the kind of guy who had spent years working with his hands, and there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that made me uneasy. He didn't wave or smile when he saw me watching from my window. He just looked in my direction for a moment before heading inside. At the time, I didn't think much of it. After all, people move in and out of neighborhoods all the time. But something about the way he looked at me, that cold, distant stare, stayed with me. It was a couple of weeks after he moved in when I had my first real interaction with him. I was out in my yard, trimming the bushes along the fence, when I saw him standing on his porch, watching me. He didn't say anything, just stood there with his arms crossed, his eyes following my every move. "Hey," I called out, trying to break the tension with a friendly smile. "How's it going?" He didn't respond at first, just stared at me like he was sizing me up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "You live alone?" he asked, his voice low and gravely. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Yeah, just me." He nodded again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's good," he muttered. "Easier that way." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just forced a laugh and went back to trimming the bushes. The rest of the afternoon, I could feel his eyes on me, even after he went back inside. There was something unsettling about the way he watched, like he was trying to figure me out, like he was waiting for something. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the weeks passed, the neighbor, whose name I later learned was John, became more and more unpredictable. At first, I'd see him pacing up and down his driveway at odd hours of the night, muttering to himself. He'd leave his trash cans out for days after collection, sometimes throwing random objects into my yard. I even caught him standing by the fence once, staring at my house in the early hours of the morning. But it wasn't just the weird behavior. There was something darker, something more threatening about him that began to seep into my daily life. One night, I came home to find my mailbox smashed in. It had been fine when I left for work, but now it was crumpled like someone had taken a bat to it. I couldn't prove it was John, but I had a gut feeling he was involved. Things escalated after that. There were nights when I would hear him outside, yelling at someone, though I never saw anyone else there. His voice would carry through the thin walls of my house, shouting incoherent, angry words that made my skin crawl. Sometimes it sounded like he was arguing with himself, his voice switching between low mutters and harsh screams. I told myself I would talk to him about it, maybe try to calm things down, but every time I thought about confronting him, the memory of that cold stare, that calculating look in his eyes, stopped me. I didn't know what he was capable of, and I didn't want to find out. The final straw came one Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on my porch, reading, trying to enjoy a quiet day, when I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I looked up, startled, and saw John standing in his yard, a beer bottle still in his hand, the remains of another one lying broken on the ground between our houses. I stood up, ready to say something, when he looked at me. There was something in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine, something unhinged. "What's your problem?" he shouted, his voice slurred with anger and alcohol. "You think you're better than me, huh? Sitting there, pretending like you don't see me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know what you're talking about, I stammered. He staggered closer, his face twisted in fury. Don't play dumb with me, he snarled. I see the way you look at me. You think I'm some kind of freak, don't you? I didn't know what to say. Every instinct was telling me to get inside, to lock the doors and call the police. But I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing as he got closer. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I don't want any trouble. Let's just forget about it, okay? He stopped a few feet from me, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For a moment, I thought he might hit me. The tension between us crackled like static in the air. Then, just as quickly as it had started, he backed off. Yeah, sure, he muttered, turning away. Forget about it. But as he walked back to his house, I knew it wasn't over. The look in his eyes, the anger simmering beneath the surface, it was only a matter of time before things got worse. After that day, I couldn't shake the fear. I tried to go about my life as usual, but every time I left the house, every time I stepped outside, I found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting John to appear out of nowhere. His presence became a constant shadow in my life, looming over me, making even the simplest tasks feel dangerous. The shouting didn't stop either. Late at night, I'd hear him outside, screaming at the top of his lungs. Sometimes it was just incoherent rambling. Other times he'd shout my name, taunting me, daring me to come out and face him. I never did. I stayed locked inside, the lights off, praying he wouldn't try to break in. One night, I woke to the sound of pounding on my front door. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The pounding was relentless, like someone was trying to break the door down. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own fear. There's someone at my door, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He's trying to get in. Stay on the line, the operator said. Officers are on their way. I stayed in the bedroom, huddled against the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The pounding continued for what felt like an eternity before it finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, my mind racing with thoughts of what John might do next. When the police arrived, they found nothing. John was back in his house, the lights off, as if nothing had happened. They told me to file a report, but without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The tension between us reached its breaking point a few weeks later. It was late in the afternoon, and I was getting ready to leave for work when I heard the sound of something shattering outside. I rushed to the window and saw John standing by the fence, a brick in his hand, the window of my car smashed to pieces. That was it, I'd had enough. I grabbed my phone and stormed outside, dialing the police as I walked. What the hell is your problem? I shouted, my voice trembling with anger and fear. John just stood there, a twisted grin on his face, his eyes gleaming with malice. You think you can call the cops on me? He sneered. You think they'll stop me? I've been through worse than this, and I always come out on top. I took a step back, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just angry, he was dangerous, and I had no idea what he was capable of. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, John had retreated back into his house. They arrested him for property damage, but I knew it wouldn't be the end. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I couldn't stay here anymore. The fear had consumed every part of my life, turning my home into a prison. I couldn't live with the constant threat of John's anger, the uncertainty of what he might do next. The next morning, I put the house up for sale. I didn't care about losing money or the inconvenience of moving. I just needed to get out. It took a few months, but eventually I found a buyer. I packed my things, locked the door one last time, and left the neighborhood behind. But even today, in my new home, I still can't trust my neighbors, and I don't think I ever will. When my wife and I moved into our new house, we thought it was a dream come true. It was a charming 2-story home, exactly the kind of place we'd been looking for. The neighbors were friendly, the streets were clean, and we had plenty of space to start a family. The first couple of weeks were filled with unpacking, meeting the neighbors, and getting settled. Everyone seemed welcoming, and we quickly felt at home. But one neighbor in particular stood out. Her name was Mrs. Hathaway, an elderly woman who lived next door. She was a bit overbearing, but seemed sweet enough. On the day we moved in, she came over with a casserole and introduced herself with an enthusiasm that bordered on excessive. "I've lived here for over 30 years, she said, her voice high-pitched and breathy. "I've seen families come and go, but I always make sure to welcome the new folks. If you ever need anything at all, just let me know." My wife and I exchanged polite smiles and we thanked her for the casserole. At first, I thought it was just a bit of neighborly kindness, but over the following days, Mrs. Hathaway became a constant presence in our lives. Every time my wife stepped outside to water the plants or check the mail, there she was, waving and calling out, asking how we were doing, or offering unsolicited advice on everything from gardening to home repairs. At first, it was harmless, even a little endearing. But soon, it started to feel a little invasive, like she always knew what we were doing, where we were going, even when we were just trying to enjoy some peace and quiet in our own home. A few weeks after we moved in, Mrs. Hathaway's visits became more frequent. She started showing up at odd times, sometimes early in the morning, other times late at night. She would knock on the door, uninvited, and bring over random things, freshly baked cookies, gardening tools, magazines. At first, we didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just lonely. But then, one night, she knocked on our door at nearly 10 p.m. My wife and I had just settled in to watch a movie, and the sudden knock startled us. I opened the door to find Mrs. Hathaway standing there, holding a basket of muffins. "I thought you might like these," she said, smiling sweetly, though something in the way she looked at me gave me the creeps. I forced a polite smile and thanked her, though I couldn't hide the irritation in my voice. My wife shot me a look, and I knew she felt the same. We were trying to have a quiet night together, and her uninvited visit felt like an intrusion. After she left, I turned to my wife. "This is getting a little weird, right?" She nodded, her brows furrowed in concern. "She's just being friendly, I guess. But showing up this late, it's strange." Over the next few days, the visits continued. Sometimes she'd knock on the door just to ask if we needed anything. Other times, she'd drop off random items like old books or trinkets. It wasn't the gifts themselves that bothered us. It was the constant, unrelenting attention. One Saturday afternoon, my wife and I were outside, working in the garden. Mrs. Hathaway, of course, was watching from her porch. Every time we looked over, she was there, her eyes fixed on us, not even trying to hide it. After a while, my wife whispered, "She's creeping me out." I couldn't deny it anymore. Something about her felt off, like she was trying too hard to insert herself into our lives. We decided to start keeping our distance, being polite but firm whenever she came over. But it didn't work. One evening, we came home to find Mrs. Hathaway standing in our backyard. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there looking around as if she owned the place. I froze, not sure how to react. My wife was behind me, her hand gripping my arm tightly. "What is she doing here?" she whispered, her voice laced with fear. I stepped outside and called out to her. "Mrs. Hathaway?" "What are you doing?" She turned to me, a wide smile on her face. "Oh, I was just checking on the garden. I thought you could use some help with those roses." My patience snapped. "You can't just come into our yard like that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We appreciate your help, but this is our home. You need to respect our privacy." For a moment, her smile faltered. Her eyes darkened, and her expression became unreadable. But then, just as quickly as the change had come, she was back to her sweet, smiling self. "Oh, I didn't mean any harm, dear," she said softly. "I just want to help." That night, my wife and I talked about it for hours. We didn't want to be rude, but her behavior was crossing a line. It wasn't just friendly anymore, it felt invasive, like she was trying to control every aspect of our lives. We decided to set some boundaries. The next time she came over, I made it clear that while we appreciated her kindness, we needed our space. She seemed to understand, nodding and smiling as always. But that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, my wife came to me with a look of horror on her face. "You need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. She led me to the living room where she had been dusting the shelves. Hidden behind a stack of books, she found a small, old-fashioned camera. I stared at it, my mind racing. "Where did this come from?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "There's more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She showed me 2 more cameras, one hidden in the kitchen, the other in the hallway. They were small, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. My stomach twisted in knots. Mrs. Hathaway had been in our house. She had planted cameras, watching us, recording us. I felt sick. Without saying another word, I grabbed the cameras and stormed next door. I banged on her door, my anger boiling over. When she opened it, I held up the cameras, my hands shaking. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. Her expression didn't change. She didn't look surprised, didn't even seem concerned. She just smiled that same unsettling smile. "I was just looking out for you," she said calmly, "making sure you were safe." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You were spying on us." She tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "I care about you, dear. I'm just trying to protect you." I didn't say anything else. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got back inside, I called the police. The police came and took my statement, but Mrs. Hathaway wasn't arrested. There was no evidence she had placed the cameras, nothing that could tie her directly to the invasion of our privacy. All we had were suspicions, and that wasn't enough. But the fear didn't go away. If anything, it grew worse. Mrs. Hathaway no longer visited, no longer brought over casseroles or gardening tools. But we could feel her presence lurking just beyond the walls of our home. Every time we went outside, we could see her through the curtains, watching us. The police told us to install security cameras, but even that didn't help the gnawing feeling that she was always there, always watching. One night, my wife woke up screaming. I rushed to her side, my heart racing, and she told me she had seen someone standing in the doorway. But when I checked, there was no one there. That was the final straw. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the house. We stayed in a hotel for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. I knew we couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a house that felt more like a prison than a home. A few weeks later, we sold the house. We never looked back. It's been over a year since we moved away from that neighborhood. I don't know what Mrs. Hathaway's intentions were, and I don't want to know. All I know is that she was obsessed with us, obsessed with controlling every aspect of our lives. I had lived in my house for about a year before I started noticing things weren't quite right. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things. I would come home from work and find that the blinds in the living room were slightly open, even though I was sure I'd closed them before leaving. Sometimes the kitchen light would be on, even though I distinctly remembered turning it off before heading out in the morning. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. After all, working long hours and living alone made it easy to overlook the little things. But after a while, those little things started to pile up. One day, I came home after a particularly long shift to find the front door slightly ajar. Not enough to raise immediate alarm, but just enough to send a chill down my spine. I stood on the porch, staring at the door, wondering if maybe I hadn't closed it all the way that morning. My neighborhood was quiet and safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I pushed the door open, slowly stepping inside. The house was quiet, just as I'd left it. Everything seemed normal, but that lingering unease wouldn't go away. I checked the windows, double-checked the locks, and reassured myself that it was probably just fatigue. Maybe I had left the door slightly open. I had a habit of rushing out in the mornings, after all, but a few days later, it happened again. This time, I was sure I had locked the door. I remember standing in the hallway, keys in hand, turning the deadbolt before I left for work. But when I got home that evening, the door was unlocked. My heart sank as I stood on the porch, staring at the door, my pulse quickening. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe the lock was faulty, that maybe I hadn't turned it all the way. I stepped inside cautiously, my senses heightened, listening for anything out of place. The house was quiet, too quiet. I walked through each room, checking the windows, checking the back door, trying to reassure myself that nothing had happened. That's when I noticed it. The kitchen drawers where I kept the silverware were open. Not wide open, but just enough to show that someone had been rifling through them. I froze. I had been rushing that morning, but there was no way I'd left the drawers open. I always shut them before leaving. I walked closer, my eyes scanning the counter. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the sense of unease was impossible to shake. Someone had been in my house. As the days went on, the strange occurrences continued. I'd come home to find things slightly out of place. A chair pulled out from the dining table, a book moved from its usual spot, the shower curtain drawn back when I was certain I'd left it closed. It was like someone was going through my things, but never taking anything, just disturbing the order of my home. I became paranoid. Every time I left for work, I'd check and recheck the locks, making sure they were secure. I'd close every window, draw the curtains tight, and even started placing small objects in strategic places, so I'd know if someone had been inside. It wasn't long before I started suspecting my neighbor, Frank. Frank lived next door, and while he seemed friendly enough, there was something about him that made me uneasy. He was always outside, tinkering in his garage or sitting on his porch, watching the neighborhood. He had a way of making small talk that felt intrusive, like he knew more about me than he should. He'd comment on when I left for work, when I came home, when I had guests over. At first, I thought he was just overly friendly, but now I wasn't so sure. One evening, I came home to find the lights in my bedroom on. I never left them on, not even when I was in a rush. My heart raced as I slowly made my way through the house, checking each room, trying to stay calm. Everything was where it should be, except for the bedroom. There, on my nightstand, was a small trinket, something I didn't recognize. A keychain with a tiny flashlight attached. It wasn't mine. I hadn't bought it, and I hadn't had anyone over in weeks. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. Had Frank been in my house? Was he messing with me? The thought made my skin crawl. I grabbed the keychain and marched over to his house, adrenaline surging through my veins. Frank was sitting on his porch as usual, sipping a beer. He smiled as I approached, but there was something off about it, something that made me want to turn around and walk away. "Evening," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Everything okay?" I held up the keychain. "Did you leave this in my house?" Frank looked at it, his expression blank for a moment. Then he chuckled. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Someone's been in my house," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "And I think it's you." He raised his hands in mock surrender. Whoa, calm down. I don't know what's going on in your house, but it sure as hell isn't me. Maybe you're just forgetting things." Stress can do that, you know. I wanted to believe him, but the smirk on his face, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long, told me everything I needed to know. The next day, I bought security cameras. If Frank was breaking into my house, I was going to catch him. I installed them around the perimeter, making sure every angle was covered. That night, I slept with my phone next to me, ready to check the footage if anything happened. For a few nights, everything was quiet. No signs of entry, no missing items, nothing out of place. I started to relax, thinking maybe I had scared Frank off by confronting him. But then, one night, the motion detector on the cameras went off. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, waking me from a light sleep. I grabbed it, my heart racing as I opened the app to check the footage. The grainy video feed showed the side of the house, the dark shadows stretching across the lawn. And then I saw him. Frank. He was crouching near the side window, the one I always kept locked. He was fiddling with the latch, trying to get it open. My stomach twisted in fear and rage as I watched him. He had been doing this all along. I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation to the operator. As I spoke, I kept my eyes on the feed, watching as Frank finally managed to push the window open. He slipped inside, moving with a practiced ease, like he'd done it 100 times before. I didn't wait. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and crept down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind was racing with fear, with anger. How dare he come into my home, my space, and act like he owned it? I heard him before I saw him. His footsteps soft on the carpet as he made his way through the house. He was in the kitchen, his back turned to me, rummaging through the drawers. Without thinking, I swung the bat. It connected with a sickening thud, and Frank crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. I stood over him, shaking, adrenaline coursing through me as the sound of sirens approached in the distance. The police arrived within minutes, pulling Frank to his feet and slapping handcuffs on him. I stood in the doorway, watching as they led him out to the squad car. He didn't say a word, just glared at me with those cold, calculating eyes. The officers took my statement, reviewed the footage, and confirmed what I already knew. Frank had been breaking into my house for weeks, maybe even longer. He was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering. Even after Frank was arrested, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I changed the locks, added more cameras, and even installed a security system. My home, once a place of safety, now felt like a cage, a place where I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next invasion. I moved out a few months later. I couldn't live there anymore, not with the memories of Frank and the way he violated my space. I found a new place, a small apartment in the city where I could disappear among the crowds. But even now, I still feel that same unease. I still check the locks 3 times before I leave. I still scan the security cameras every night before bed. Moving into my new place had me excited. It was just within my budget, but it felt like progress. I spent the first few weeks unpacking and decorating. The house wasn't big, but it had a backyard, and the neighborhood seemed peaceful. I quickly fell into a pattern: work, come home, relax, repeat. It was all I'd ever wanted, or at least it felt that way at first. It didn't take long before I noticed him. My neighbor, an older man who lived directly across the street, he was always around. Whenever I pulled into the driveway after work, he was there, sitting on his porch or standing in his yard. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. He was retired, maybe, or just liked spending time outside. But then I realized something strange. No matter what time I came home, early in the morning, late at night, or on weekends, he was always there, watching. I would park my car, and there he was, sitting on his porch, staring directly at my house. His gaze was unsettling, unwavering. It wasn't the casual glance of a neighbor watching the world go by. It felt deliberate, intense. He never waved, never smiled, just watched. At first, I tried to shrug it off. People can be weird sometimes, right? Maybe he was just lonely, maybe he didn't realize how creepy it came across. But the more I saw him, the more his constant presence gnawed at me. The first time I told a friend about it, they laughed it off. Old people get bored, they said. He probably just doesn't have anything better to do. That made sense, and I tried to believe it. But as the days passed, the watching became harder to ignore. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find him in his usual spot, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee in his hand. The sun was setting. I tried to pretend I didn't notice him as I got out of my car, my keys jangling in my hand. I could feel his eyes on me as I made my way to the front door. But something was different this time. His gaze felt more focused, more intense. I glanced over my shoulder, just a quick look to confirm my suspicion. He was standing now. I froze for a second, my heart beating a little faster. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes locked on me, his expression blank. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But even inside, the discomfort lingered. I went about my usual routine, making dinner, watching TV, trying to relax, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I peeked out the window. The street was dark, the only light coming from the dim street lamps. His house was completely dark, but I knew he was in there, somewhere, probably still watching. Things escalated over the next few weeks. At first, it was just the feeling of being watched from across the street. But then I started noticing things in my own yard, small things that were out of place. A garden hose moved from where I'd left it, footprints in the dirt near the side of the house, the back gate left open when I knew I'd closed it. One Saturday morning, I was out mowing the lawn when I felt that familiar prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I looked up, and there he was, standing at the edge of his driveway, watching me again. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the handle of the lawnmower. I had tried to ignore him for weeks, hoping he'd get the message and leave me alone. But now I couldn't take it anymore. I cut the engine and walked over to the edge of my yard. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my tone light. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. "Look," I said, my frustration rising. "I've noticed you watching me a lot. Is there a problem?" Still, he said nothing. The silence was suffocating. I opened my mouth to say something else, but then he turned and walked away, disappearing into his house without a word. I stood there, dumbfounded, my heart racing. It was as if I didn't exist to him, like I wasn't even worth acknowledging. From that point on, I started avoiding my front yard. I spent more time inside, keeping the blinds closed and only going out when I had to. Every time I pulled into the driveway, I would scan his porch to see if he was there, watching. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't, but the feeling never left me. Things got worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. It was late, past midnight, and the house was quiet. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I stayed still, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. There it was again, the soft crunch of gravel, like someone was walking along the side of the house. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands shaking as I turned on the flashlight app. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I pulled back the curtains. For a second, I thought I was alone. The yard was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the streetlights. But then I saw him. He was standing in my yard. I gasped, stumbling backward, dropping the phone in my panic. He was right there, less than 10 feet from my window, just standing there, watching. I scrambled with the phone, my mind racing with fear. I called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what was happening. "He's in my yard," I whispered, my heart pounding. "My neighbor, he's outside watching me." The operator assured me that officers were on the way, but the minutes felt like hours. I stayed hidden in the corner of the room, clutching the phone, my eyes locked on the window. But when the police arrived and searched the yard, he was gone. There were no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to prove that he had been there at all. I knew what I had seen, but without evidence, there was nothing the police could do. They took my statement and left, but the fear remained. I tried to carry on with my life after that, but the paranoia had taken hold. Every night, I double-checked the locks, made sure the windows were closed, and left the lights on in every room. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, watching me from the shadows. One evening, I came home late from work, exhausted and stressed. I parked in the driveway, the familiar sense of dread creeping over me as I looked at his house. The porch light was on, but there was no sign of him. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For a moment, I thought maybe tonight would be different. Maybe I'd get some peace. But then, I saw it. On the kitchen table where I always left my keys was a note, a small, crumpled piece of paper folded neatly in half. I froze. I hadn't left anything on the table. I was sure of it. With trembling hands, I unfolded the note. The words were scrawled in shaky handwriting, almost childlike in its messiness. "I see you." My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my panic. My mind raced. How had he gotten in? How long had he been in my house? I hadn't seen any signs of a break-in, but the note was undeniable. I grabbed my phone and called the police again. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't live like this. The police came, took my statement, and searched the house from top to bottom. But once again, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence. It was like he really knew how to leave no trace. And what scared the hell out of me was that I had no idea who I was dealing with. I packed my things that night and left. I couldn't stay in that house another moment, not with the constant feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I stayed with a friend for a few weeks while I looked for a new place, far away from that neighborhood, far away from him. I never saw my creepy neighbor again, but the memory of his cold, watching eyes has never left me, and I'll never forget the way he made me feel. If these chilling neighbor stories left you on edge, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling horror tales. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. You won't want to be caught off guard by the next scare. Have your own terrifying neighbor experience? Share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are closer than you think. I'll see you in the next nightmare.